Hi everyone, Matt here. Welcome back to the channel. So, I promised you that I was going to record some more videos on the coronavirus and the psychological impact that that's been having on people. However, in the meantime, I had the opportunity to speak with someone, a real good opportunity that I just couldn't turn down. So I had the chance to speak with Tim Cowley. Now, Tim was actually kidnapped in 1995 and held hostage in the Colombian Jungle for 4 months in total. And I had a conversation with him and I just asked him about his experience, really. He told me about what happened during those 4 months, how he dealt with it on a psychological level, and also potentially some of the things that he learned from it going away. Now, I did make a vain attempt during the conversation to steer it towards the coronavirus, just to look for some read across, really, between the lack of control that he felt at the time, the lack of certainty, the huge amount of uncertainty that was going on. And when we had the conversation, it was right in the height of the lockdown that people were going through. So I just wondered whether there were any lessons between the two. Now, I know there's a huge difference in terms of the scale and how extreme those two cases are. However, there were some interesting things that he brought out. He talked a lot about the importance of resilience, which I'll leave to Tim to tell you more about. He talked a lot about this idea of structuring your day and his focus and his values that really got him through. And there were some really practical tools and ideas in terms of how people can pick up on some of the positives that come from such an uncertain and such a challenging time. Anyway, I won't spoil it. I'll let Tim tell you more about it. But one thing I do need to say is that the internet connection we had was quite bad at the time. So the audio is a bit sketchy here and there. I've done my very best to kind of cut it down so that it's as coherent as possible as you're watching it through. And all the real good content was still in there. So I was really pleased with that. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I do. And I hope I see you back on the channel in the future as well. Thank you very much for joining me. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me. I'll start by getting you to introduce yourself, if that's okay, and tell us a little bit more about what happened in 1995.
So my name's Tim Cowley. In 1995, I used to work for the British Embassy in Bogota, in Colombia. And in August 95, I'd gone bird watching with a friend called Francisco to the Dodgy Valley, which is in Tolima, on the Central Cordillera in Colombia. And about 3 p.m., we just turned around to head off to our accommodation for the night on a track. And we were taken at gunpoint to a nearby village. And at that point, they wanted me to go and get a ransom to release Francisco. We had an argument with guerrillas. I was trying to basically get both of us to be freed in exchange for my car. That failed, and instead they decided they would take me as hostage, and Francisco would be the messenger going back asking for a ransom. And that was the start of me spending 118 days living between about 11 and 13,000 feet in Andean temperate rainforest.
Wow. 118 days, you said?
Yeah, 4 months roughly. Yeah.
4 months. So in terms of the experience, so well, I guess just generally starting, how was it? So what did it involve? What happened to you? Was it?
So for me, if I was going to be held anywhere, outdoors would have been my preferred option. Mm-hmm. I've had a career in the military. I've always enjoyed traveling. As a bird watcher, I like to spend my time outdoors. And I think my experience is probably very different from those who had been held inside buildings or underground in their periods of capture. So, yeah, I was quite lucky in that respect. There was other things that I think helped me from my experience before I got kidnapped, such as I traveled widely in 1988. I drove from Gambia all the way to Kenya, going up through the Sahara and down through the Congo, seeing how people in very different circumstances lived. And that gave me an appreciation for the things that I had in my life and the things that I had got just by good fortune, really, by where I'd been born and who my parents were and things like that. I didn't deserve them. They were given to me as a birthright, really. And then in 1992, I trained as a paratrooper. And that, although it's a physical course, it's actually the mental resilience that gets you through it rather than just the physical hardship. So those two experiences helped prepare me for what was about to happen to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of kind of treatment and your experience of the whole thing, could you tell us a bit more about kind of the day-to-day, how that worked when you were
So the first 12 days were the most difficult. I knew that obviously the British government doesn't negotiate with kidnappers, and it was a criminal kidnapping in that they wanted money rather than trying to get some political favours. And so I believed that there was a good chance that the guerrillas would be frustrated by the government stance, and that I would either be killed or I would be mutilated to show that they were serious about their demands. So the first 12 days were really difficult. So in the first 48 hours, we actually spent a lot of time moving, gaining in altitude and getting further and further away from civilization. And so I didn't have a great deal of time to do a great deal for myself. But I quickly realized that I needed to concentrate on coming up with some sort of routine. So I made sure that I woke up at the same time as the guerrilla group. I would then get into their regime, which was up to wash and do any laundry, obviously all in jungle streams. And then basically after lunch, they would spend a lot of time doing training and doing reading. So I would also read anything that would fill my time. One of the things that I found was an aid, because again, very quickly, it's difficult to control your feelings when you don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's a great deal of uncertainty. I could have spent all day just thinking about close family, what was going to happen to them, what was going to happen to me. And so I disciplined myself that when I woke up in the morning, I would think about my family briefly. At the time that my 2-year-old son would be going to bed, I would then think about them again. And then before I went to sleep, again, I would think about them. And also, after about 8 weeks, I was successful in getting one of the people who was guarding me to purchase a small radio, one of these sort of pocket radios. And I was able to tune into English songs, even though the radio station was a Colombian radio station. So what I would do is I would listen to, and I bought a set of headphones because they didn't rob me of my cash. And so I would, immediately before going to sleep, I would think ahead for the next 24 hours whilst listening to music. And I would decide on my plan. So I had a structure for the next day. And that was really important. So every day I tried to have something to look forward to doing, even though I had no control over where I was living, no control over what I was eating, no control over what I was wearing, no control over my health, other than I had to take as many precautions as I could to make sure I was fit and healthy. I'd set myself a single aim, which was to get home, regardless of whatever it took to do that. And I set myself 5 goals within that. I don't really want to go over those because it was sort of my approach as a soldier to getting home successfully. But having a plan, it just took some of the pressure off, basically.
Really, really interesting. And Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, just because you've mentioned a couple of the themes there around kind of obviously the lack of control, complete lack of control that you had at the time, and also the huge amount of uncertainty. So I don't want to kind of downplay it, because as I said in the intro, you know, completely different experiences and completely different scale in terms of extremity. But do you think there are any kind of similarities, or, you know, potential similarities between what people are going through now when they're feeling themselves in lockdown? It's a different experience for people, essentially. Obviously, your experience is very, very different from people, you know, being able to shop and exercise every day. It's a little bit different, but, you know, that overriding sense of not knowing how long something will last, or the uncertainty that goes alongside that, or the lack of control. What do you think, or do you think that's too much of a stretch?
I found the first 12 days of my kidnapping to be the most difficult, because I didn't sleep, because I assumed they would try and kill me. So I was always ready to fight for my life, essentially. And what happened in the first 12 days was all of the things that perhaps I hadn't done particularly well in life, I hadn't appreciated fully or shown my appreciation for, those things came back to haunt me. And so I think anyone who goes through a stressful situation, like many people are going to find this stressful. I think some of the baggage of life that you take into one of these situations is going to affect you while you're going through this. That would be my own experience anyway. For some people will benefit from this because they're already in good shape, and they will see there's an opportunity here to do some good things. So again, whilst I was being held, I did some really good things. I was able to read books on Latin American politics. I was able to draw pictures. I wrote a 113,000 word book in 35 days. I studied the feeding patterns of hummingbirds. But at the same time, you know, there were some very dark days, because I would worry about the future of my wife, the future of my son, the fact that I probably wouldn't get to see them again. It was things like listening to Tears in Heaven by Eric Clapton, the song he wrote about his own son, would obviously affect my emotions. So I do think that depending on how resilient people are before this happened, I think will have an effect on them during this. I think there'll be lots of people who are used to being able to have whatever they want, and having it, especially in this days of the internet and online shopping, having things almost instantly, all of a sudden you don't have the freedom to go and eat where you want to eat, don't have the freedom or maybe the availability to get hold of the foods or drink that you're used to. And I think that those sort of the restrictions on individuals, I think those things are in common. And what I would hope is that perhaps when people are going through this experience of having these restrictions on them, there will be some positives that they'll hold on to once they come out of the other side of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good thought in terms of, I mean, spoken to quite a few people over the last few weeks, you know, going through lockdown. That's one of the things that people mention, is that obviously, you know, there's a real challenge around some of this stuff, but, you know, the circumstances bring potential positives as well. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting one. What about, you've mentioned a couple of times your emotions during the experience. So obviously the emotions must have been quite fraught in those first 12 days that you've talked about there, but after that, did they level out, or was it good days, bad days, or how would you describe that?
Well, the first 12 days were difficult because I'd assumed at some point I was going to end up fighting for my life. Well, on the 12th day, I attempted to escape, so I did fight for my life. And the fact that I wasn't executed at the end of that showed me that I was a more important or valuable asset to the group than I thought previously. And so, and I just want to add very quickly that Colombia is a very different place now to what it was in 1995. But after those first 12 days, I took some confidence from the fact that they hadn't hurt me in any way, and the structure, the daily regime that I was planning was reaping rewards. It was the little things sometimes that would upset me. For instance, one of the female gorillas, her laughter was identical to my sister's. It would be a particular song that was on La Mega radio station, as I've already mentioned, that would bring back a memory, and that would upset me. And certainly, initially, I wanted to show that I was strong and resilient to this group, that, you know, I wasn't afraid of them. So I bottled up my emotions, I suppose. But that particular Eric Clapton song, that really did get to me one day, and I couldn't help crying. I was crying silently, but the group had seen me upset. And I realized that actually my emotions had an effect on them. And so from that point onwards, whether I was happy or whether I was sad, I just let my emotions be my emotions. I didn't try to bottle them up or hide them. It was just healthier for me. And again, by me not having any or trying to get rid of any pent-up aggression, it was less likely to end up with conflict between me and the gorillas. And I would imagine if people can, you know, release some of their emotions in small chunks rather than big chunks, it will probably help with people living with their relatives in intense and stressful times. But there were also light-hearted moments. You know, I would remember Billy Connolly or Ronnie Corbett jokes. The disadvantage it would normally be when I was laid trying to get to sleep at night, and I would start laughing, and the guard would ask me what was happening, and I'd tell them the joke. I'd translate it into Spanish. And then they would laugh, and then each time they changed the guard, I'd have to repeat the same joke over and over again, on the hour, every hour.
So there was those small kind of, lighter moments in between the quite heavy stuff in between, I guess.
Yeah, well, and people will be experiencing that now at home, won't they? They'll be amusing times as well as difficult times.
Well, one thing that came to mind just as you were talking then was, I don't know if you've come across them, they're quite popularized these days, these ideas of change curves and how people move through a series of events. Have you seen them that track the grief cycle? So you're talking about, you know, people start with denial and then they go through a real slump and then they eventually get to acceptance. Would you say that that's something that you...
I don't know anything about curves, Matt. You'd have to describe that to me.
That's fine. No, this isn't. It's not the same as the curves that are all in the media at the moment. No, but yeah. So this idea that if you experience some sort of grief or some sort of major change, full stop, that people experience different stages. So you initially have some sort of denial. So this isn't really happening to me. That's quickly followed by this is real. Then it dips at its lowest ebb to a sense of almost a feeling of depression. You know, I'm not going to get out of whatever change it may be. And then that eventually in these curves leads to a period of acceptance. And you see people kind of moving through that curve. Do you think that's something that you experienced, or was it a bit more nuanced than that?
Before I was kidnapped, I'd watched a documentary about the Mujahideen and how they made the transition from civilian to soldier. And part of that ritual was that they essentially buried their old life literally in a box, and then took on a new name. And so literally in the first few hours of my kidnapping, I decided that the best way of confronting what was going to happen would be to do something similar. So I didn't have this issue of denial at all. I suppose I embraced it at the beginning and realized I was in trouble. Um, and to some extent, it was going to be a little bit like going through a nightmare. But I just had to concentrate on getting through whatever that took.
And then, do you feel like it got to a period of acceptance, or was it?
I'd say I'd accepted it from day one.
Okay.
The question was always going to be, was I going to be killed during it, or at what point would I be released? So again, going back to those 5 goals, one of those was to keep healthy. Others were not to cause arguments with any of them, because that person, if I somehow affected their pride or standing in the group, these were the people that were going to be more likely to volunteer to hurt me. So I avoided any confrontation throughout, apart from the night when I tried to escape and ended up fighting with 2 girls.
I love that idea though, about having, an overriding goal, i.e. getting through something, but then, that just having those, whether it's 4 or 5, pillars or rules that you adhere to, gives you a bit of structure, I guess. You called them goals. I'd almost call them, like I say, kind of rules or values that you'd live by, that guide your behaviour almost. It's a really interesting point. Okay. Cool. So the good news was you started chatting to me today. So you got out, they let you go. So could you tell us a little bit, just a little bit about that, how that came about, and also how it felt, I guess, when you were eventually released?
Well, during my time, I think I moved around 12 times, 12 different camps. Eventually, I was extracted and I was taken back to Bogota. And the first 48 hours essentially was sort of media and interviews in Bogota. And then I flew back overnight on the 3rd day, then went into psychological debriefings and physical and dental examinations to make sure I was fit. And the team that looked after me and did the psychological debriefings were the same team that had looked after Terry Waite and Brian Keenan and John McCarthy. So they had lots of experience. They gave me sort of 10 things that I needed to be aware of, that I may suffer from. And one of those, they said, I would definitely suffer from. I may suffer from 1 to 10 or all 10 or anywhere in between. The one that I would definitely suffer from would be having an abnormal reaction to an everyday event. So sort of anger management. And I didn't really believe that, because whilst I don't mind looking after myself, I'm not normally someone who gets too angry. But they were right. And about 2 months later, I did have an episode where I could have easily hurt somebody who was just happened to be on the other side of the road. But from the rush of adrenaline that I had, I knew this was the abnormal reaction to an everyday event that they described to me, and nothing happened. I was able to just stop what was about to happen. So that was an important lesson, in that, yes, I was free, and initially, there was all the euphoria of being free, of being reunited with my family. My body was still going through those changes, and there may be lessons there that when this is over, that could linger on.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like I say again, but potentially a stretch, but when people get out of lockdown, as it were, and go back to what they call it's the new normal, isn't it? That's what people are calling it. And the question being, will people just have this euphoria and rush straight back to the pub, or straight back to do the things that they couldn't do while they were in lockdown? Or do you think that actually potentially kind of values will have changed? they'll have realised different things are more important to them and prioritise them first, or whatever it may be. I'm not too sure.
I think we'll see. I think we'll see the whole spectrum. I think there will be some people that will take some really good things out of what's happening. You know, hope on the exercises we've been doing. We've seen lots more people out walking. Hopefully, people will, you know, see the benefits of being outdoors and looking after the environment. There's also been quite a lot of camaraderie between different people. Hopefully, that will continue in the future. But unfortunately, I think often people remember the values that they either have discovered or rediscovered. I think sometimes aspirations of, you know, genuine good intent to trying to do things in the future, if people don't have a plan for that, very quickly life gets in the way again, and new priorities leapfrog them.
And just on what you were talking about there, I wanted to ask you actually. Obviously, it's a little while back now. Was there anything that you wish you'd taken forward from the experience?
Well, the thing, reflecting on what my behaviour had been like before I was kidnapped, was I hadn't always treated people well all the time, and perhaps I hadn't appreciated things. And one person in particular I hadn't appreciated was what my mother had done for me and my brother and sister. And so my relationship with my mother, that just changed overnight when I got back. And generally, although I did appreciate people a lot from the moment I got back from Africa in 1988, I think it was even more solid when I got back from Colombia. I did wonder about maybe giving up bird watching as something to sacrifice as a lesson learned, perhaps from this. And for a little while, I didn't own a telescope, but I'm afraid I've gone back on that.
Well, I could tell by the books in the background and the models that that may not have lasted, but there you go. But not in the Colombian jungle now, I'm guessing.
Not yet. I do want to go back though. I do want to go back.
Yeah, that's an interesting. So, have you been back to Colombia since as a whole, or?
No, but it's part of the plan. I would love to go back. Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I've never had a nightmare about what happened to me. I do have thoughts about what I went through, and things, sights, smells, sounds do remind me of things. But I think I've got through this in reasonably good shape compared to some people.
One final question, if you don't mind. Do you think you changed as a result of it?
Just in that valuing people more.
Mm.
I think that was the most important thing that I took out of that.
That's interesting. And I'm sorry to jump back just very quickly, but one of the things you mentioned was the potential to become to adversely react to an everyday occurrence. Because another way of looking at it would be that you would never get stressed anymore, right? Because you've kind of been in such a stressful situation before that there's a potential that you'd always be able to put everything in perspective. You know, the current lockdown, doesn't even, it seems silly me mentioning it when you've got the story that you have, comparing those two things. It's chalk and cheese, but people react to the situation they found themselves in quite.
I was described once as a bit of a swan. Yeah, I might look calm on the exterior, but trust me, I'm paddling like everyone else below the surface.
Okay. Cool. Perfect. Seems like a good place to end. So thank you very much for doing this interview today. I really appreciate it. It's been really helpful. It's been in terms of the experience that you went through, and really interested in terms of the emotional side of that as well. And I think there's some interesting lessons, different scale, but I do think there are some interesting lessons that people can take away around kind of personal resilience and getting yourself through difficult times, and also, yeah, trying to keep hold of those nuggets of positivity that come from even a really negative event and keeping them going afterwards. So yeah, that's been great.